Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing and Freedom Journey. Mark DeJesus here. I am your brother from another mother, bringing you insights along the way. I am all about mental, emotional, and relationship health. And if you are too, you have arrived at a great place today. What I want to do is continue in a series I've called the Trauma Healing Journey. And layer by layer, episode, session, we're going to look at the subject of trauma. And it is a subject we can spend a lot of time learning and understanding. But my goal is to provide you some insight, provide you some perspectives that can help you along the way to understand trauma for yourself and also those you interact with. Because I find insights on trauma can help you in relationships to understand people in a better way, to also be a helpful vessel for what people are going through and you being a blessing to their journey. And today what I want to get into is, why does trauma affect us all so differently? So we're going to get into some major factors that contribute to this. Why does it seem like trauma affects people around us in so many different ways? And in the last session, I talked about the signs and symptoms of trauma. For some people, you can easily detect trauma symptoms. For others, it's a lot more suppressed, it's more hidden. You got to get to know them a bit more to see it. But regardless, there are a variety of ways that trauma impacts people, and there's reasons for this. And a lot of it has to do with many influential factors that are in play before the trauma even happens. While your body is designed to handle certain intensely stressful situations, or even recover from some traumatic moments with protective and healing responses, there are a number of factors that we need to be aware of that contribute to the negative impact of trauma that kicks in long after the event happens. And you notice there's some things we seem to be able to resiliently work through, and there's other areas that really stick with us, hit us, and have a negative impact on our journey. It's like they remain with us while we're trying to move forward on our journey. So I want to get into the major factors that influence trauma's impact and how it affects you. And I think the first area we got to get into is understanding your stress response. This is very important. And again, I'm going at this subject like I always do, layer by layer, precept by precept. Many times we want to get to, well, what do I do? What's the technique? And this and that. We want a quick little thing. And I want to encourage you, take a journey perspective in all things when it comes to mental health. Take a journey mindset. It will help you greatly to not come under the constant accusation and condemnation and feelings of defeat and hopelessness that can certainly come out of traumatic experiences and the struggle of working through it. So let's first look at the stress response, because it was designed by God to help you handle, cope with, and work through stressful moments, and even protect you from times of danger. In a healthy context, your stress response gears up for a crisis, right? It gears up. That's your fight or flight, we're going to get into in just a moment. Then it's designed to bring you back down into a place of peace, which is called homeostasis, if you want a technical term. With a traumatic experience, though, your stress response kicks into high gear, and it can stay on that high alert kind of state. So let's understand this, of what happens in your body, the physiological changes that take place when you are engaging your stress response. These are involuntary reactions. You don't go, okay, heart start beating faster. This stuff just starts happening. And I listed them out here. You have an increased heart rate and increase in blood pressure. The heart pumps faster to deliver oxygen-rich blood to the muscles. Blood pressure rises to facilitate this rapid circulation that's now going on. The second thing is your breathing begins to increase. By the way, in looking back to heart rate increase, I noticed even in my pastoral work, people would come up for prayer. I feel like I'm having heart trouble. And sometimes in just talking to them, praying with them, I said, have you gotten checked? I haven't. Maybe they're scared to, whatever. They go get checked. And it's so common. They go, nothing's wrong with you. Nothing in the measurement is showing there's something wrong. And it shows how many people are under the effects of anxiety and even panic attacks. And it also shows, too, where many people have stuck trauma that is just still having residue work within their body. Anyway, second thing is your breathing gets rapid. Your lungs are now starting to grab more oxygen. So your breathing becomes faster and shallower. That's why when it comes to trauma healing steps, one of the most practical things you can learn to do is to, on a regular basis, just focus on slowing down your breathing. Most people, when you tell them this, they realize how shallow and fast their breathing is. So in through your nose, out through your mouth is a simple way. I talk about that in my video you can look up on biblical meditation about what that looks like. People get confused about that subject. And one of the simple things that's very helpful is what's called the sigh. It's a way of, it's a self-nurturing experience that helps to let your body know, I'm safe and I want to engage in safety. That's a side thing for your understanding and for your healing journey. But that, no matter where you go with healing healthy steps when it comes to trauma, daily breathing exercises can be very, very simple and very helpful to allow the signals of safety to be reintegrated into your mind, into your body. Okay, back to the stress response. So your muscles tense up. Why? Because you need to flex them and use them. So muscle tension increases preparing for physical action. And sometimes you can get a trembling or a shaking kind of mechanism. At some point, I'm going to show you a video that you can look up yourself about a polar bear shaking off stress. It's a quick little video. You can look it up yourself on YouTube. But it shows the stress of a moment and what the polar bear does to kind of shake off what they experience. You ever have a moment where you just kind of like, you just kind of shake your arms, or you do that kind of thing, like you're shaking something off? There is a help that kind of doing that helps releases tension from your muscles. And maybe too, that's why like massage helps, because it's kind of help getting the tension out of the muscles. But you'll notice when you get into a stress response that you can have a sense of trembling or shaking kick in. Some people, it's hypoglycemia too. You know, their blood sugar's kicking in, and they need something to eat. That also comes into play as well too. But I found for myself, and I have a number of church situations where I would put into the category of somewhere in the spectrum of trauma and interactions that I've had. And I found that over time, these symptoms would kick up in any situation that seemed like it was going there. And one of them is I'd feel like I'm shaking. It's just like my fight or flight would kick in. And it's telling me like, I'm up for a fight right now. Gear up. So you're already getting a sense and a picture of what happens and takes place. So I'm bringing out the natural stress response. Then we're going to talk about trauma's impact and like what influences our intense reaction to what takes place when it comes to a traumatic experience. So number 4 is dilated pupils, where the pupils widen to allow more light to enter into the eyes. We need our vision to be enhanced. And in God's design, it's for a moment where we need to focus. So there are good stresses in life in the sense of like you have a job to do. So like right now, there's a little bit of that in operation with me. I'm focused on this camera. I'm focused on my notes. I've got, my sound. I've got my video over here. Got other notes over here, right? And I'm not relaxing, just thinking about a bunch of things. I'm also not in a intense anxiety state. I'm in more of what I call the zone. And so it's a little bit of this, what I'm showing up on the screen, happening and taking place. When this gets into overboard, where we start developing this adaptation, where now we're coping with long-term stress, where this stuff's happening on a regular basis. So it can produce constant anxiety, panic attacks, obsessiveness, even depression. Okay, then you also have redirected blood flow. And blood flow is needed. It moves away from non-essential areas like digestion, and it moves towards the muscles, towards the lungs, towards the heart. You can also get like flush or pale skin, right? Because blood flow is moving or changing. Sometimes those of you, when you get nervous or you get anxious or you get a little insecure, you may have like redness on your skin or patches, that can kind of form in a moment where you're a bit stressed. This is important to understand because when you're in your stress response, you're taking energy from certain areas and moving them to other areas to utilize. The work of adrenaline is taking place. So you're taking energy from your digestive tract because it's not time to eat. It's time to deal with a stressor. So for many of you, when stress hits, you lose your appetite, right? Others can go into another kind of version of this where then they just want to eat more. So you become a stress eater. And typically you go to carbs to help nurture you, make yourself feel better, and sugar and things like that. So we're not going to eat. We're going to deal with the stressor at hand. It also takes energy from your reproductive organs, right? It's not time to be intimate with your spouse. It's not time to make babies. It's time to deal with a stressor at hand. And so your body's pulling resources to utilize. Now, for many people, they live in a low-level version of this all the time. And so it starts to wear away because one of the things that gets pulled from is your immune system. Because what the body's saying is, we're not going to fight off a cold right now. We're going to deal with a bear that's jumped out of the woods. And in the short term, that's fine. In long term, it's taxing your body's vitality. It's now tapping away at your immune system. And this is one of the reasons why people who have significant trauma or have complex trauma, PTSD, they can have physiological issues that start to arise afterwards because they've been in this constant fight or flight, in this stress response kind of state, and it's tapping away at their immune system. So this energy kind of change is important to recognize. Now, after it's over, we're meant to go back to our state of homeostasis, but many people never do. Okay, hormone release. I have that on the list. The adrenal glands release hormones like adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol. Cortisol is a big factor because cortisol has to do with your stress response and utilization of resources. These hormones amplify the changes and that surge of energy you get, right? And for many people, cortisol can get tapped away and they can have messed up cortisol levels, especially those who develop what's called PTSD. The signals are also, number 7, saying digestion's going to slow down. Again, we're not focusing on eating. We're focusing on temporarily conserving energy to deal with a stressor. You also have increased sweating that takes place, right? The sweating increases to cool the body down as you're going to exert energy right now. And then there's heightened senses. Almost get the picture of like somebody hunting and maybe an animal's attacking them and they're being vigilant to deal with the stress at hand. So your senses become sharper. Your hearing is more heightened. You're more sensitive to what's happening, right? In everyday life, like if you're a surgeon working you're in surgery, or you are a teacher and you're speaking, these things at a low level, temporarily, can be helpful. That's why we have to understand there is good stress in life. Many people think in order to heal our stress response, we just need to be like in a blanket all day and just in a bubble. Not necessarily. You need a balance of healthy recovery with also healthy stretching that takes place, where you're allowing yourself to practice resilience. Okay? So that's important to understand. Now, what makes trauma very challenging is your body and your mind can retain these responses and like they're just continually flaring up, and flaring up. And there's 4 aspects to this that I would like to share with you. these four aspects of the stress response when it comes to trauma. Many of you are familiar with the first two. You may not be familiar with the third one. The fourth one is not recognized or talked about as much. And hopefully this can bring some awareness. Okay, your stress response kicks in. There's an aspect of it that manifests in what's called fight. Commonly, fight or flight is a term we utilize. I've been teaching on the importance of understanding at a basic level the fight or flight system for probably about 20 years now, at least. And the fight part of it, this is the gearing up aspect of your stress response. This is, I got to put up my dukes. I gotta defend myself. You get a surge of adrenaline, a surge of energy. The feelings can be very intense, where you can feel shaky, you can feel irritable, you can feel angry, you can even feel violent. Now, for many people that develop this as a trauma response that kind of stays with them, they can often become the fighters. That's their stress response. You put up your dukes, any sense of danger, and you're fighting. It's very, very common that many men have this response where there's irrational anger or they just snap in a moment. A trauma response is kicking up to defend. But that's not just men. Women have this too, where you develop a strong personality. No one's going to take advantage of me. You become a fighter. So anger becomes a big part of this component. This is important. There's also, and I put this word on the slide here, drivenness. There is a aspect of drivenness that's fueled by the fight response. I got to fight to prove myself. I got to fight to show that I have worth. I got to fight to show that I have value. It's like this survival mechanism. And I found it helpful in my healing journey to renounce the mindset of drivenness because it forms so much of my life. But often this comes out of the fight response. Like I gotta defend myself. I gotta prove myself. I gotta earn my way in survival. Okay? The fight response here is it's confronting a perceived threat. And it may be similar to what you experienced in the past. It may be of distant similarity, but if your brain picks up on it, it can kick into this gear. And so it's meant to, in a normal, I'm using that in air quotes because what is normal, but in a typical situation where maybe you need to defend yourself or maybe somebody's getting robbed or something's happening or somebody got hurt and you need to jump in and help, right? And that kind of thing is what's kicking up and kicking into gear. Many who suffer trauma can have this as a very strong response, where this like shaking, it can even happen. You feel hyper vigilant to any possible enemy. In fact, you can feel like there's enemies around you all the time. You anticipate that people are enemies. You assume that they're enemies, right? Because you just don't feel safe. You don't feel safe that you can land. So putting up your dukes, so to speak, to use that metaphor, becomes a protective response. I think all of us could, whether you've had significant trauma or not, I think all of us could use equipping on how to handle the fight response that kicks up in us. How we defend ourselves, we get angry, we start yelling, we get argumentative, we get resentful. I think that there's a great need for us to learn when the fight response comes up of learning to let it work through our members. Because this is a big part of trauma healing, but it's also a part of mental health healing in general. Is learning how to let emotions, especially the unwanted ones, like anxiety, panic, obsessiveness, and anger, to work its way through our physiology. What we often do is once it kicks up, we either feed it or we suppress it and run from it as much as possible. And this takes learning. It takes patient practice. It takes awareness to walk through newer patterns. So the second one I want to get into is the flight. Add an L, and now you're in flight. This is your stress response that kicks in to get away, to avoid, or to escape. That word avoid is a key component because it fuels avoidance. In my opinion, number 2, number 3, and number 4 are tied together. So the freeze and fawn, this is just my opinion. the freeze and fawn are forms of flight. You have the fight, right? I'm coming at you. I'm defending myself. The flight, I got to get out of here. I believe the freeze and fawn are forms of that. But flight, and that's just my opinion. The flight is big on avoidance. Now, your stress response is kicking in to say you got to get away from the threat, the potential danger, or to escape danger. In a typical situation, this could teach you, hey, just don't go playing over by that cliff over there. You could get right. So that slight flight kicks in to back up in a healthy way. But for a lot of people, this gets confusing because now we live in a pattern of avoidance. And this could kick in at a very young age, but trauma really amplifies our avoidance patterns. Because with flight, you're feeling anxiousness, you could feel panic, you feel a sense of, I got to get out of here, I got to get away. I talk about this in my material on anxiety disorders, about how we want to, you're in a grocery store and you get hit with anxiety or even a panic attack. What you end up doing is, I got to get out of here. You may just leave your grocery cart with the stuff in there, get out, and drive home. Home being a place of safety. Okay? So that's kind of what happens and takes place with this. With flight, you can learn to avoid certain dangers, but avoidance can begin to build and expand. So now it's spreading out into a lot of situations where now you're avoiding certain environments, you're avoiding certain conversations, you avoid conflict, you avoid even something that represents something that you consider to be dangerous, even in your thoughts. The biggest thing that you need to remember about flight is it fuels avoidance behaviors. And we have all kinds of avoidance behaviors. And that can even get into what sometimes they talk about mental health, of safety behaviors, things that we do that are artificial forms of support and many of them get compulsive. This is a way I'm going to feel safe, but they often fuel our avoidance patterns and working through the things that fear has trained us in unhelpful ways. So that's a big area to understand. Then the third is freeze. And I believe that freeze is part of the flight because it's like, I got to get out of here, but my system's overwhelmed. Freeze is the body going into a state of immobility. You, by the very nature of the word, you freeze up. The body becomes immobile in the place of a threat. It often occurs when your body's like fight or flight. Which do I do? You're just stuck. It's like the computer just freezes as far as your faculties. There can be a sense of numbness. You can have a sense of dissociation. And this can also lead to patterns of hypervigilance where you're still, but your mind is scanning the environment. Okay, so the freeze is a part of this. And I think if we look back in our life, there are a lot of moments where we recognize we just froze. We're overwhelmed with what we're seeing. Like, is this even happening? Is this even true? The fourth one here is fawn. And this I find in my research and just watching this becomes an extension of how trauma affects a person. It's the one it's very complex to explain, but basically it's conditioning you to be one where you immediately, and it becomes a pattern in your life, you try to appease or please the perceived threat, the person who's creating the threat. This becomes big in things like complex trauma and struggles like that. It's characterized by people-pleasing behavior, seeking approval, avoiding conflict, and it's shown in people who've experienced prolonged abuse or trauma. They develop this survival skill, and they will seek to meet the needs of others to the detriment of their own. Now, the Bible says don't just look out for the needs of yourself. Look out for the needs of others. It's not what this is talking about. It's talking about where you completely ignore yourself and you're just seeking to survive by pleasing the other person. And it gets into a lot of people pleasing, seeking approval, and dysfunctional ways that you're trying to meet and make somebody else happy. It's often used as a way to avoid conflict and try to maintain some semblance of safety. Okay, so this gives you an understanding in a little bit of like the stress response of trauma and how it interacts with our minds, but also what our body is showing. So in a healthy place, this can protect you, this can help you. But with trauma, your stress response becomes hijacked. I'm going to bring a quote from The Body Keeps the Score, which I find there's just some great statements in there in understanding trauma. Adrenaline is one of the hormones that are critical to help us fight back or flee in the face of danger. Increased adrenaline was responsible for our participants' dramatic rise in heart rate and blood pressure while listening to their trauma narrative. So they're bringing up the trauma, and all these symptoms are taking place in their bodies. Under normal conditions, people react to a threat with a temporary increase in their stress hormones. As soon as the threat is over, the hormones dissipate and the body returns to normal. The stress hormones of traumatized people, in contrast, take much longer to return to baseline and spike quickly and disproportionately in response to mildly stressful stimuli. The insidious effects of constantly elevated stress hormones include memory and attention problems, irritability, and sleep disorders. They also contribute to many long-term health issues depending on which body system is most vulnerable in a particular individual. Gives a good summary to some things I covered. This is helping us understand the deadly impact of trauma can be the aftermath. And a thing I want to add to this is now the toxic thinking patterns, the way we see ourselves, the way we see God, the way we see the world around us, that now we're carrying on, and our ability to process love, peace, and stability is greatly hampered by the influence of what's taken place. So when we look at trauma, let's look at some common influencers or predictors of trauma's impact on a person, okay? I want to get into those, and we're going to list those out here. These are common influencers and common predictors that have an influence. And the first at the top of the list is genetics, okay? And we're all affected at different levels by trauma. But there's a lot of things we need to understand about our wiring, our coping mechanisms, of things before the trauma even occurs. And genetics is one that we need to bring right to the surface, because research is showing so many things can be inherited. Diseases can be inherited. Even personality traits can be inherited. We even say this socially, oh, he's just like his father, she's just like her mother. Now, I want to spread this into further understanding in your generations. There's many things that you inherit. Have you thought of you inherit your family's response to trauma, your family's stress response? What was your parents? How did they respond to stress in their life? How did they deal with trauma? What kind of traumas did they have in their own life that you're aware of? When it comes to genetics, we also need to understand in your family line, what were the mental health issues that arose? Because trauma can really put a explosion to a particular mental health battleground, like anxiety, like depression, like panic attacks, like OCD, right? So I think it's helpful to understand, where'd you come from? And I think it's helpful to do just a simple family tree exercise of what kind of patterns, what kind of dysfunctional patterns are in the family, what kind of mental health battlegrounds do we see in the family, whether they admit to it or not. You can even go, I think grandpa was, he had some mood issues, something, I can't put my finger on it. He didn't get diagnosed, but you just kind of like put your own sense of what you saw or witnessed or even heard in some of the family stories, because many of these patterns travel down generations. And so this is important in your understanding, because you're also renewing your generations in Christ Jesus, right? But there is research that's showing when it comes to trauma, the aspects of trauma passed down generationally. And there's a couple areas that I would look at for your learning journey. One is the mindsets that travel down generationally, right? So for example, maybe you had a relative who went through the depression, and out of the depression, the trauma of going through that, they become very, very fearful regarding their finances. So they nitpick finances. They can be very apt to not being generous. They just kind of like hold on to everything. They get very anxious when it comes to bills, expenses, so forth. Okay. And then you see in your life, you have those same mindsets, but you never went through the depression. That's an example of that. So the mindsets in the family that travel down generations, the anger battles, the anxiety battles, the easily offended, judgmentalism. Take your biggest battles that you have in your life with mindsets, with thinking patterns, and I will guarantee you there's been a lot of this traveling in your generations. You're not the first in your family to deal with these struggles. In fact, I deal with a lot of OCD, and many people recognize, yeah, my dad had this. He never recognized it. He never dealt with it, but he was very compulsive and had a lot of intrusive kind of things that he was always fussing with. Just an example. Okay, so there's also research, and this gets complicated, so I won't spend a lot of time diving into it. But there is research of trying to understand, does the trauma itself get passed down in the genetics, so to speak, from one generation to another? And so a person has, is it possible the person has that generationally? It's still a complicated subject, and research and how do you put markers on that? But I think there's an interesting story that psychologists and trauma people will bring up. And it's not a human story. It has to do with animals, but it is interesting because I think there's some parallels that we could relate to. And it has to do with a boundary between Germany and Czechoslovakia and red deer and a heavy boundary that was there at one point. It was called the Iron Curtain. And this has to do with the Cold War. So let me explain it to you. There was a border between communist and democratic countries that was called the Iron Curtain. One area in particular is the border between what was then Czechoslovakia and West Germany. It was heavily fortified with fences, electrical wires, armed guards. It was a significant barrier, so no one could cross it, including animals, especially a population of red deer that would often move back and forth in this area. So after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the physical barriers were removed, allowing for free movement. But researchers found 25 years later, the red deer population was continuing to be reluctant to cross over. They were GPS tracking these red deer, and they revealed their migrations pattern stuck to the same inherited historical boundaries from decades ago. The deer had established territorial behaviors that were passed down through the generations, even after the original cause of those behaviors was gone. And this is you can look this up for yourself. The study was brought out, I want to say in 2014, so this is over 10 years ago. But it's an interesting way of looking at how trauma and the mindsets of trauma and genetics were ways of thinking, feeling, and acting get passed down. Your genetics bring about a carrying of mindsets. And I think that, in my opinion, God meant for this to be good in the sense of you pass down from generation to generation blessings. You pass down mindsets. It's inherited, but it's also reinforced in culture, right? This is what embeds generational mindsets. Yes, it's in the genetics, but it's also reinforced in culture, in our family, in the people we hang out with, churches you go to, society, wherever you rub shoulders, these mindsets get reinforced, okay? And so certain aspects of your generations can make you more vulnerable, psychology would say predisposed to certain mental health struggles. So what would you say in your family? Take a moment And think about this. What would you say in your family, what you inherited would make you more predisposed to? So people say, man, that needle points really strong towards addictions. Oh, it points really strong towards obsessiveness, really strong to perfectionism, really strong to being anxious, right? You see these things going down our generation. Now, we're all on a journey of allowing God to renew our generations, because I do believe in generational healing, generational renewal. We are new creations in Christ Jesus. However, I see this theologically and psychologically as a journey. It's not just something you just say a prayer and all of a sudden everything's changing in your generations. It's a journey of renewal. Okay? Now, this talk isn't based on just, hold on a second, I got to plug in my keyboard there. I got a wireless keyboard and the battery was dying there. So hopefully this will help bring a little bit of understanding. Your battles didn't start with you. And trauma may be a factor in your generations as well, too. It's important to understand. And you can look up that story on your own that I shared with you. The second area is birth, and this will get into a lot of areas that I could cover. So I'm going to try to stay focused. But I have found in my heart healing work with people, I found it to be very interesting to understand people's birth experience, their story of being born. I would just casually ask, tell me about your birth. Tell me about your early childhood and the situation around when you were born. And in my work, I found people's birth stories to be very fascinating and at times heartbreaking. Now, what I'm about to share with you may not be considered in the umbrella of trauma from psychology's observational standpoint. I believe, though, that there's some spiritual aspects that we need to understand, because there's things that go on in your conception, in your birth. You don't remember it. You don't remember this time in your life. You have no memory of it. But yet there's things and circumstances that could impact you spiritually and emotionally down the line, because we are spirit, we have a soul, we live in a body. Okay, so this may not, what I'm about to share in this section may not be in textbook trauma areas. However, there are things I'm going to share with you that I say definitely are traumatic and have an impact on people's lives in the years and decades of growing up. Now, birth itself, when you understand just the experience of being born as the baby enters through the birth canal, you're born into the world in what is basically a controlled trauma. You're in your mother's womb, and all of a sudden, you're coming out. You're now interacting with the world. A doctor, maybe mother, father, whoever else is there. So that's a controlled trauma. Now, this may help in your understanding, like surgery. When you go in for surgery, that's a controlled trauma. You're cutting open your body. Something is being rearranged or something surgically being removed. The body is going under trauma. That's why you need significant recovery and healing after you have surgery from this controlled trauma. Same thing with birth. Okay, so there's kind of two areas I want to bring out. One is, for many mothers, giving birth is a very traumatic experience because of the complications that take place. You have story after story after story I've taken in of mothers and the painful, traumatic experiences they've had when giving birth. So that's one aspect. But I want to go back to you and when you were born, because there's a number of things that could take place that contribute to your journey and development. A couple things I want to bring out. Number one, there's many babies born C-section, whether it was through emergency C-section or then because of that, another pregnancy they didn't want to risk, so they go C-section again. The one of the problems is that the baby doesn't receive the essential bacteria in going through the birth canal. There's an experience of bacteria that the baby gets exposed to, and that helps the immune system. And so they're finding in research this affects it can affect the body in certain immune issues and health down the road. Okay, let me get even deeper to some of the things that I consider to be spiritually traumatic. One of them is when a baby is born and given away. Adoption takes place. This is now a spiritually traumatic kind of moment. I would even say, too, it's a trauma kind of moment in the standard definition of trauma. However, the baby doesn't grow up and remember, I remember being handed off and I remember them signing the papers. So there's no memory recall of this. But I've watched this over and over again in my one-on-one work, group help, answering people's questions, in my pastoral work, even being a youth pastor. I've seen this over and over again. Children that are adopted, there are aspects of identity that they're working through. And it often hits in like the teenage years. Oftentimes rebellion starts kicking up, right? Because what's happening is it's all this stuff is flushing through their system, and they may or may not even know what they're dealing with. It may just come out in rebellion or just anger. I see it happen all the time. Many parents are just so loving and generous that they want to just provide a safe home, but they don't realize a safe home is great, but there's going to be some rough waters you're going to need to wade through with this child, because the trauma of their birth and what happened there, spiritually and emotionally, and I would even believe neurologically, can kind of want to chase them down. And that's why healing in the Father's love is so important, because all of us are connecting to a Father who loves us in Christ Jesus. But when there has been a disconnect in your biological parent, this now is some deeper healing that's needed. Because our earthly parents were meant to be a safe place that then launch us into relating to our Heavenly Father in a deeper way. But even that is compromise, so to speak. Can't think of a better word when it comes to adoption. There are some, too, that their birth is around a lot of shame. It may be a baby that's born out of wedlock. There is circumstances where an affair is hidden. Family secrets are going on. Many people are taking these DNA tests, and they're trying to figure out ancestry and things like that. And at the same time, family secrets are now coming to the surface that were all covered over and no one's going to know, and things like that. And so I've worked with this with families where the shame just blankets the family and blankets how they relate. And then there's struggles with identity. There's struggles with they're like wandering. They struggle to fit in. They struggle to connect. There's this shame on their shoulders. Why am I bringing these things up? Because I think it's important for us to recognize sometimes simple things and how they affected our journey and how they affected how we see ourselves, and learning to allow God to heal even down to our entrance into this world. That's why I encourage everyone. I think, and I do this in layers. I even had a really meaningful experience a few weeks ago with Psalm 139. And I recommend that believers continually go through Psalm 139 to recognize the beauty of their birth. I have teachings on that, materials on that. In my God Loves Me, I Love Myself material, I connect to that. I have talks, I think it's called God Knows Me, or Understanding Your Worth and Value by Your Creator, something like that. You can look that up. But to allow the words of God's heart washing over us, that our life matters, because no matter your situations around your birth, God has a beautiful design for you in your creation, and also you being a new creation in Christ Jesus. And so I found that to be a healthy and helpful exercise in just reflecting on my birth, that He is so glad that I was born, that He loves me. And that's one of the things that when we would share a Father's Love prayer, and many of you might be new to my channel, so you're new to this concept. In our material, The Heart Healing Journey, Melissa and I do a father heart prayer and a mother's heart prayer. And in the prayer, bring about renewal. I'm so glad you were born. That cuts into a meaningful place and where you matter in this world. And so, because many of us will go through life, and I'm not saying this as a silver bullet thing, so I want you to know that. Like if you were born out of wedlock, okay, if you do this one thing and pray this one prayer, then it's going to help all your issues and trauma. No, it's a part of it, though. It's a part of healing and a part of understanding how to see yourself the way that God sees you. Okay? So wanted to take some time to share and explain that. It's also your birth order is going to affect how you respond to trauma. It influences where you see yourself and belonging, how you fit in your family, how you relate out of that. Firstborns, they tend to rise up with more responsibility, right? In traumatic situations, they can tend to be the one, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to be responsible. They can also take the brunt of family brokenness. And so this can impact how they relate to trauma. Other siblings can be very comparative, can feel inferior. Other siblings can struggle with neglect. If you notice in your family, especially if you have more than one sibling, if there's like 3 of you or more, don't you notice each sibling responds to the family brokenness differently? Because their birth order, their setting in the family structure is different. And so that comes with it a variety of narrative of what we take away, what we carry as far as a perspective. This one's probably the biggest factor that I would want to bring to the table when it comes to trauma, is your parental relationship and your home life. This is major. And it is frustrating for me because I feel like in a lot of psychological circles and even therapists, they tend to overlook this. I've even had in my own therapy work where very little, in one situation, very little was asked about my upbringing, about the relationship with my parents. I'm amazed that therapists will spend so much time working with someone and not have an intake of what home life was like, what their parent relationship was like. Your parents are the most influential human voice in your life, period. Whether you're 10 years old, 5 years old, 100 years old. If your parents have passed away, their voices and how they conducted themselves is still echoing. And God designed that to be a very powerful thing, a very good thing. However, when they're broken and that brokenness just continues to just work in the family system, it creates a lot of problems. Now, there's a book that I read in my reading over the years by Dan Allender. It's called The Wounded Heart. I don't have a picture of it. The book's called The Wounded Heart. It's an older book. I do have to say some great insights. It's also there's some very, very, very rough stories, very raw and rough stories that he shares. So just wanted to throw that out there. But in recognition of brokenness in our family, trauma, addictions, OCD, anxiety, I find in my work and many other therapists and people in their work and pastors in their work who have a value for heart healing see this. Well, we can deny the influence of what our upbringing brought about. So Dan Allender wrote in his book, The Wounded Heart, he said, I'm continually amazed how often someone who was abused will begin by telling me they had a happy childhood and they were richly loved, how richly loved they felt by their mother and their father, even though their history indicates nothing could be further from the truth. And I think there's a sense, I watch this all the time. In our healing journey, there's a sense of like, we want to defend our family. It's kind of a natural inclination to defend their tribe. Then we feel that admitting to brokenness or admitting to sin, admitting to problematic patterns in the home means we are disrespecting and dishonoring family. And I want to insert that doesn't have to be that way. That's not necessarily true. You can recognize things in your family without being disrespectful and without being dishonoring. But there's a form of denial that we often work through, that we need to work through. In the book, the Red Book of the Adult Children of Alcoholics, they mention this when it comes to addicts. And the book says, we cannot have it both ways. We cannot say our childhood was perfect, loving, or eventful, and then act out with addictions or other compulsions. Because there's this conflict that often happens where, yes, and people will say this to me all the time. Yeah, I grew up in a loving home, and they kind of throw that blanket over it. And I go, wait, tell me about your home. And almost all the time, you go, okay, that blanket you threw over that is highly inaccurate. So when understanding how trauma affects your life, a couple questions. One, did you bond well with your mother and father? Were you able to feel loved and feel safe? A father's love brings that sense of covering, identity, protection. A mother's nurture brings that coziness, that sense of I'm safe. I can heal from difficult days and challenges. Were you able to bond to that and really truly connect to that? Two, did your parents equip you emotionally? Did they equip you in being able to recognize your emotions, be able to talk through things? Number three is, how did your parents handle their own stresses in life? I recognize this as a parent because I'm learning and renewing how I handle stress and recognizing, what am I modeling for my kids and what it means to handle stress? So what was that for you growing up? What did not what your parents necessarily said, although that's important, but what did they do? What did you watch them behave in whenever it came to stress? Okay, so let's go back to these factors that I want you to understand more. Is your life experience with danger. So someone who's had little to no experience with tough and challenging life experiences can be more vulnerable to being very easily overwhelmed, and where something can have a very deep traumatic impact. And I talked about this in a previous broadcast about the anxious generation, easily overwhelmed generation. I'm having lots of conversations with my daughter even about this too, as her generation tends to overthink a lot of things. And, they feel anxious about so many things. Their nervous system is easily overwhelmed. And so I'm having lots of conversations with people in this age bracket that I guess what you could call the Gen Z age bracket, even up into millennials, having conversations about how to develop a sense of safety and how to develop a sense of resilience so that everyday things aren't constantly triggering constant anxiety. And so I think we're going to see over time, what are some of the factors that have been going on. But many people could see something that is adventurous. And that same situation could be seen by another person as incredibly overwhelming and incredibly stressful. I think of the movie Twister, and I don't mean the recent movie Twisters. I mean the old school one, without an S, Twister, with Bill Paxton and Helen Hunt. Great movie. But the main character, Bill Paxton, he's going through a divorce with his wife, Helen Hunt. And there's this whole scenario where he's a tornado chaser. And he's moving on from that relationship, and they're trying to get the final papers signed. They've been separated, blah, blah, blah. And he has a new girlfriend played by Jamie Gertz. And you see the difference in response to someone who's used to seeing a stressful thing like a tornado. I, of course, would probably have more of a response like Jamie Gertz. I don't have it like her character because I don't have experience with tornadoes, right? But Helen Hunt's character and Bill Paxton's character, they rise up to it. It's like, this is it. This is the adventure. They're almost like soldiers getting ready to do what they were made to do. Now, it almost moved into, not almost, it moved into an aspect where it was like an addiction. They were just like, they were hooked on chasing tornadoes, which many people can be adrenaline junkies. Whereas Jamie Gertz's character, I forget what her name was, she's like, I'm out. I can't handle this. I'm out. And so that's an important factor to understand, because someone could be heavily overwhelmed by a situation and make them more prone to the traumatic imprint, and somebody else because they're used to that. So this is something to keep in mind in your understanding. Another factor is your general overall sense of feeling safe in the world. Let me ask you that question. Do you, just from a default setting, do you feel like your world is safe? Or do you feel like everything's dark, everything's unsafe? So that's going to influence how experiences linger in your life. If you do find the world feels so unsafe, maybe it'd be a good exercise to go, what factors are influencing this? The news, social media, people in my life. Some of you would say some of my relatives influence this. Another factor is the history of substance abuse before the trauma. This is important because people who experience trauma, substance abuse often increases. If there's an addiction in place already, there's high odds this thing is going to be used as a coping mechanism, increasing the use, where now working through emotions becomes more challenging because when the uncomfortable emotion rises up, you go to the addiction, you self-medicate, you numb out. So then it becomes more difficult to actually work through the emotions that came about in trauma. Furthermore, those who are in addiction recovery, they often have a history of trauma that has fueled their addiction struggle. Many of them have complex trauma. And so they're needing to learn how to work through its addiction recovery is not just breaking the habit. A lot of people put their energy and focus into it like that. I just got to stop using. It's more about learning to work through the emotions that addictions mask over, that don't give you the room and space to grieve, to feel through, to let go, to be kind to yourself, to renew. Okay, so this is now going to lead me into some of your overall ways in dealing with stress. And these are some words that you can kind of understand that go, yeah, I think that one has an influence in my life. One is hypersensitivity. Traditional psychology would call this neuroticism, right? But hypersensitivity is great. Hypersensitivity is just, it's haywire. It's picking up on so many things constantly. Catastrophizing, where there's a higher rate of you just constantly seeing the worst. That's going to impact how you deal with a difficult experience. Now, there's another one that I find that's very, very interesting, and that's hyper-positive people. Hyper-positive people will jump to seeing the brighter side of things right away, as soon as possible, and they can even get stuck in that to where it's a form of denial. I remember I had experience, I showed a little bit of this, not to knock the other person, but many years ago, went with some family, my wife and kids and some family. We went to New Hampshire for vacation. We lived in Connecticut at the time. We drove up to New Hampshire here in the States. And we went to this place. You can look it up yourself. It's called the Kankamangas River. It's a very beautiful area. We pulled along the side of the road. My kids were very little at the time. And there was a place where you could wade in the water. And there's a bunch of people there, and it was really cool and really fun. Well, I found this spot further down the water where you could go, and the rocks were so slippery, you could slide, and then it would kind of end at this point where you could stand up. There were some rocks you could stand up. So I did that. Whoa, I felt great, And I told my relative, I told my son and kids, So my son, Maximus, I can't remember how old he was. He was pretty young at the time. He goes, slides down, and I catch him. So I tell my sister-in-law, come on, you go too. She comes and slides and comes down, and I'm standing in like kind of gravel rock, and I catch her, and I'm starting to slide because I'm holding my son, holding her. Then her daughter comes. And now I am realizing, wow, this water is pretty strong. And I actually lose my grip, and we start going down the river. And my stress response is kicking in massive high gear because I'm trying to hold everybody, and I can't. So we end up going to the spot down the river. I've told this story before, but for the sake of understanding, let's get help. What took place afterwards. As we're going down, there's a helplessness that kind of kicks in. We're like, we're going to get carried downstream. I don't know like, is there waterfalls down here? It's pretty treacherous. I do believe there was a God moment. That's just my perception, because two people showed up out of nowhere and helped pull us to the side. And so what we did was they pulled us to the other side. So if the river, let me show it like this. If the river is going like this way and we went down, our truck and everything's parked over here. So we're down the river. They brought us to the other side of the river, and we were now climbing from rock to rock, coming back. It was all just woods. It was a very thick wood, so it wasn't like there was a path we could just walk down and then cross over. We went over rock to rock to rock. We had to help each other over these big boulders, get across, get down, back up the river, and then people were starting to see. Attention was brought to this. They got some rafts out and some things, and they started one by one taking us across. Well, talk about an overwhelmed stress response. I was feeling a number of things. One is I was feeling massive guilt because I told my sister-in-law and my niece to join us, and we almost could have gotten very badly hurt. Something could have happened. Two, I was also overwhelmed because we were in a season where we were newly coming to grips with my son's being on the autism spectrum. And I just saw how, in one sense, he was just being playful, but he had no idea what was even going on. He was like in a kind of playful state. He just saw the whole thing as a game. Looking back, I go, maybe that was helpful and protective for him to not realize we almost got really, really badly hurt. So heart's racing. I'm in that stress response. I'm coming back. My wife, she's at the shore there. She's in a place of heightened stress. And so in that, I'm hypervigilant. I'm hypersensitive. I'm catastrophic in my thinking. And one of my other relatives was there, and she immediately went into hyperpositivity. And that's not what I needed in that moment. And I remember her kind of going into something. I don't remember exactly what was said, but I just remember lashing back a bit and going, "No, it's not okay." Something like that. Because I was angry. I was angry at myself. I was in that heightened stress response. So that you can see a bunch of different aspects of it where I'm hypersensitive, a bit catastrophic. It's understandable in that moment. You see, when you evaluate traumatic moments, you don't want to hyper judge them. You want to see them for what it is. And that takes time and practice, right? But there's also this, now moving on from that, there's also the sense of denial that many people, and hyperpositivity can be a form of denial. And I want to read this from The Body Keeps the Score, because van der Kolk says, "We now know there is another possible response to threat, which our scans aren't yet capable of measuring. Some people simply go into denial. Their bodies register the threat, but their conscious mind goes on as if nothing happened. However, even though the mind may learn to ignore the messages from the emotional brain, the alarm signals don't stop. The emotional brain keeps working, and stress hormones keep sending signals to the muscles to tense for action or immobilize in collapse. The physical effects on the organs go on unabated until they demand notice when they are expressed as illness." And so this is an aspect of how denial can often affect people. Deny. Then many years down the road, certain faculties of their body are showing disease or showing illness because their body's taking a toll, but they suppress it. They don't want to deal with it. They're in constant denial. There's also, and I want to add this in too, because many of you will relate to what I share about when I talk about perfectionism survival mechanisms, of focusing on, I got to do the right thing. I always do the right thing. Make sure I do the right thing. And that comes into play in the after effect because you're focused so much on, did I say the right thing, do the right thing? You don't let the grieving emotions work their way through. Because with trauma healing, we're learning to see the experience for what it is. We're learning to experience the journey through healing practices while also learning to develop resilience in our life. I know, easier said than done, but many of these factors here can come into play. There's also these coping mechanisms because trauma brings out What are our coping mechanisms? I got into some of them already, but there's more here. One is learned helplessness. This was coined by psychologist Martin Seligman, and some of his material is interesting to look through. But after repeatedly experiencing limitations, stress, and overwhelming challenges, you start to come to believe you are unable to overcome. You are unable to handle it. Nothing's ever going to change. So as a result, we can stop trying to learn or trying to improve or develop a sense of resilience, even when opportunities are presented to you. There's also the aspect of dissociation, emotionally disconnecting from yourself as a survival mechanism. Derealization, where you disconnect from reality. You feel detached from your surroundings and your environment. Depersonalization. I know these get kind of technical, but I've done talks on these. You can look them up. Where you disconnect from yourself. You feel detached and disconnected from you. And this can go into very simple things like zoning out, like simple terms we use, checking out, numbing out, blanking out. Many people can talk about their trauma experiences like an out-of-body experience where they feel disconnected. But I put at the bottom of the list here, one that I think many trauma sufferers have in their life is dismissal. You dismiss what you've been through, often saying other people had it worse. They're starving people in other countries. People have been through worse things. And so that it's a form of shame that dismisses what you've been through. And so at the same time, it keeps it just brewing. It doesn't give it room for processing. So that's important to understand. Most of us don't have strong coping mechanisms at first. Many of the trials and challenges of our life cause us to dig deeper, to develop resilience. Trauma can shatter us, so we literally feel like we're putting pieces back together. But what I want to bring as a takeaway to all these areas, this really goes down to nurture and our inability to process nurture. That's why I talk so much about nurture. It's being compassionate about yourself, allowing yourself room to heal, to process through emotions, and then give yourself simple steps to get back in the game, so to speak, to practice renewal. Now, one thing that people can tend to get confused about is venting versus processing. Because for many, they will vent their traumatic experience, share it over and over and over and over and over again. It can become a rut, but they can also just vent the anger. I think we all need room for venting. I think venting can be helpful, but venting is actually not processing. Because when you're venting, you're just letting it out and the raw emotion's there. Processing is learning to work through the emotion. How does it make you feel? What did it mean to you? What mindsets have developed? What do you believe about yourself as a result? What new mindsets can we introduce and incorporate and feel through? Allow our emotions to connect to those new perspectives that we're working through. So I often tell people, know the difference between venting and processing. Your level of support is going to be very important. What is available after the trauma? Huge. And I go back to the number one support, and that is your family and your home. God designed our family and our home to equip us, but also to be a home base for safety. So for those of you that are married, have children, your home base, where you grew up, but if you're an adult now, you're moving on to your own life, but home, that support is so important. I mentioned in a previous broadcast about the tribes of people that gathered together and how they were able to help each other work through trauma because they had that community connection. So they were just doing processing naturally. So your home base, what's your home base? Where do you feel at home? Now, when trauma enters into the home, this is very tricky because now the place that's supposed to be your home, safe home base, is no longer safe. So where do you go? And this is where people that grow up in a traumatic environment, they go to a lot of coping mechanisms because they don't feel safe anywhere. Now, a second place of safety is the body of Christ. We have our home that we grew up in, that's meant to be safe, but then our spiritual family, the body of Christ, our tribe, that I'm safe with my brothers and sisters. I can be myself. I can share what I've went through, and I'll get some understanding. I'll get some listening. I'll get encouragement, helpful prayer, helpful support. Vanderkolk says this in his Body Keeps the Score. Numerous studies of disaster responses around the globe have shown that social support is the most powerful protection against being overwhelmed by stress and trauma. There's even an aspect, too, of being able to debrief after something happens. It was helpful going back to the Kankamangas River illustration. It was helpful that after that we went and got dinner, we sat down and we debriefed, we shared. And I was even sharing my sense of like guilt and responsibility and just letting my fight or flight stress response begin to recalibrate. People who've been in an accident, if they have a debriefing after, it could be helpful in getting it started and letting what happened work through you. But I'll tell you what, it's very, very painful to cope with trauma alone. Trauma increases the sense of loneliness and just the very nature of it. So I believe I want to, in my home, create a place where we can process things that we've been through. I remember when my wife and I use this example a lot. Our son Max fell down the stairs. It was a very, very difficult experience for both of us. Melissa and I practiced not only praying over Max and how the trauma of him falling down the stairs impacted him, but also praying for each other. We were mindful of each other. How are you doing? And even praying for one another. In my marriage, I found it important that when my wife is going through maybe a difficult experience or a difficult interaction, of just being prayerful over her, being a listening ear, not to fix it, not to make everything, be Mr. Fix It, but create that home base. You're safe here. You're safe here. You're safe here. You're loved here. I want to reinforce in all my family members that this house, you're safe here. Whatever happens out there, you can come in here and process and experience that safety. I think that we all need to be people that do that in our households and also in our places of fellowship and church connections. Another factor is the nature of the actual event itself. Obviously, certain traumatic events are going to have more impact than others. Then another important influencer is the added stressors that arise after trauma. Maybe you had a trauma of a loved one dying, and now you have massive financial loss due to it. Maybe there's a loss of relationships after leaving a church that was a traumatic experience of experiencing abuse and having to leave the church and the trauma of all that. And now you've lost all your friends and you feel extra lonely. Many people talk about not just the trauma, but the after effect, or maybe you telling family of something that happened and no one believes you. And now you're dealing with that. So now it's layer on top of layer. Or because of traumatic experiences, your body shut down or went into hypervigilance and you developed an autoimmune disorder or you developed some kind of vulnerability to sickness. Because our immune system can often take the brunt of our stress response continually being hit. Now, one of the things I want to say, and then I want to get to closing as I process this whole, how does trauma affect us? One of them that's really interesting, and I pray that how I share this will help you in your own journey, is the challenge of memory. Memory is very tricky. The more I study it, the more I realize, wow, it is very interesting and challenging for us to remember what happened. It's messy. When learning about trauma, it's important to know that trauma is difficult because we don't remember 100% of what happened. We don't remember things perfectly, even though some of us may act like we do. Okay? So that's the first thing up here on this slide that I want to address, because there was a study that I read in my research, Nickerson and Adams studies called 1979. So it was a while ago they did this. It showed that people have a high confidence in being able to identify a U.S. penny. I think there's just recently they announced that they're going to stop making the penny. I think because it costs 2 cents to make something that is worth 1 cent. Anyway, people were very, very confident. I know how to identify a U.S. penny, but confidence doesn't equal accuracy, because in the study, the participants failed to identify the correct penny amongst 15 different versions. They were shown 15 different, and they failed, even though they were like, yes, I know exactly what it looks like, and I know how to identify it. They failed to identify it. Why? Because memory is tricky. And this is what makes trauma difficult. We don't necessarily have this play-by-play camera and angles and everything, and of details of every single thing that happened along the way and along the journey. Not that I think that if we did have that would be super helpful, but our ability to remember. And as time goes on, I wrote this on the slide, our ability to remember can become even more inaccurate. This makes the healing of trauma complicated, doesn't it? There can often be inaccuracies in stories. As time moves on, these inaccuracies can cloud things. So, for example, when people are interviewed after an accident, they can all give, like let's say a bunch of people in a bus accident, they can all give varying statements because A, we all see things from different angles. B, we have different life filters by which we see things. Three, we have different stress responses. And 4, we all pick up on certain details that somebody else may not pick up simply because of where we are in the incident. So I think it's important to realize that our memory has holes in it. It can have distortions, incompleteness. The filter is an important part. Your filter impacts memory. And there are certain narratives we carry around that our filter drives what we notice, what we look for, and what we remember. So for example, if you feel like life is always working against you, and that's a narrative that you carry, when something difficult happens, it immediately triggers that filter. Now, the event may be like 50-50. There's like 50% good things and 50% not so good things. It's going to tune in to see, that's it, everything works against me, right? The hyper-positive person will have their positive filter kicked in. And so they'll often say things like, well, it could have been worse. I'm just so thankful, right? Which those are not bad things, but that can also lead to denial. It all depends on the filter you carry. Because for many people, trauma, it just puts a nail in an already exposed wound of a challenging filter. And trauma, what it'll do is it shatters memory in the sense of like even linear memory. Where it has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. It's kind of just more like sparse flashes of memory. Okay, so in my research on memory, there is a type of memory that I found interesting. It's called flashbulb memory. And there's many different types of memory. And I won't get into that. It's a lot of details and can get boring. But there's this aspect of flashbulb memory, which is a memory based on something that's shocking, dramatic, important, surprising. Maybe it's a big public event, something that affects you deeply. I'll use an example. Like September 11th, 2001, we call that 9/11 here in the United States. Many other people recognize, if I just say 9/11, they would recognize that even in other countries too. Where were you when that happened? How old were you? What were you doing when the news was brought to your attention? Those of you that are older and grew up with the JFK assassination or Martin Luther King assassination, or maybe a little bit more into recent history, the Sandy Hook tragedy that took place, or going back into the 90s, the O.J. Simpson verdict. Many times in those memories, we can vividly remember. Like when the O.J. Simpson verdict came out, I knew what office, where I was at the church I worked at. I knew who was there, the conversation that we were having. And I remember kind of all the moments that were there when that event took place. 9/11 happened. I know exactly where I was. Again, I was at church going into the office, and I remember the people, remember what we were talking about, remember a lot of details that took place. And for some reason, flashbulb memories tend to, because they're more personal and they're big event, that they can have a more vivid imprint in our memory. And I wonder if there's certain aspects of trauma that affect us like that. Now, many people can feel like they don't remember a lot when it comes to a traumatic event, but there's some times where it can be flashbulb-like. I'm not speaking about this as an expert. I just wonder, because oftentimes there's sporadic things that we remember and get imprinted And maybe this kind of memory is in play with that. So I want to give you a couple practical thoughts, though, because I know in this memory section, it's kind of like many people struggle over what they remember, what they don't remember. Sometimes we can shove things into it. Sometimes we can spin. Maybe something did happen. Maybe it doesn't happen or didn't happen. We can struggle with a lot of varying things regarding memory. So something I want to share to you, to your heart, is forcing yourself to scan your memories to get more accuracy often makes things more stressful. This isn't like, okay, if something happened, I got to try really hard to remember. It's not like that. You remember what you remember, and be gracious to yourself as you're processing. I work with many people too that struggle obsessively with trying to fixate on the past and trying to nail down memories. That's a whole subject in itself. You'll want to get into some of the things that I talk about when it comes to obsessive compulsive battlegrounds. Second thing I want to say is that you don't necessarily have to relive trauma. Some people wonder, do I need to do that? You don't necessarily have to relive it, but you may need to review it. And there's a difference, because forcing somebody to relive the whole moment of the trauma can almost re-traumatize them. However, reviewing it and learning new responses when flashbacks and when triggers kick in is very, very helpful. If we do it in unfruitful ways, we can reinforce a continual loop of it, like just repeating the story, repeating what happened. It can reinforce a negative perspective, a negative focus. Whereas healthy reviewing, you're, first of all, learning how to respond in compassionate grace to the memories. That's the biggest factor. Learning to not respond to shame, not feed shame, and learning to incorporate some healing perspectives. I believe it first starts off with how we react to memories that flash up. Because when we have that happen, you can't control it. You can't control it from showing up. What you can do is learn a new response to those memories coming to the surface. Then over time, and this may be helpful with actual therapy or someone who can walk you through it, of learning to have new responses, new mindsets. The key is going to be learning to get in touch with the emotions and the body sensations and be able to work through them and release them, while also incorporating new mindsets that you learn to emotionally connect to. As you can see, it's the work of emotions that is a big part of the healing journey. And I want to leave you with this, because these are going to be reminders I'm going to bring to the surface continually. Trauma is an opportunity for us to learn how to deal with our painful past in fruitful and healing ways. We often react in shame, self-hatred, rejection, and in anxiety, whereas introducing compassion is going to be so important. And so it's also an invitation for us to learn to relate to God's love and his nurture in more personal ways. When it comes to God's love and you've had trauma in your life, the need for God's love becomes real. It's not like, oh, this is something I'll get around to. It's like, no, I need this. I need this. But the biggest takeaway I want to keep repeating over and over again is trauma and the pain of trauma. This is an invitation for you to learn daily self-compassion and learning to live in grace. This is going to be a journey of you relating to yourself in a new way. All healing is relational. And so you're learning how to relate to yourself in renewed ways. And it all starts with compassion. So what does it look like for you to look at your past through a compassionate lens? For some of you, it's going to be starving the compulsive inner critic that you feed and the narrative that you keep feeding, and start introducing a new, more compassionate mindset. What has been helpful today in the talk that I shared with you? Because I'm looking forward to session by session bringing renewed mindsets for your healing and freedom journey. If it was a help, do me a favor, click that like button, click subscribe, go over to markdejesus.com, where there will these broadcasts will be on my topics page, by the way, so you'll be able to see them and go through them. I also have a book on a mental health battleground, the OCD healing journey. Many of you that have obsessive compulsive battlegrounds, this will be a great resource. Some of you in just learning to heal and experience the heart healing journey to awaken, heal, and transform your life, get a copy of the heart healing journey, because that sets the template of how to experience more of God's compassionate grace, to see his patience, his kindness over your journey. And I know that many of you will benefit from getting that resource in your life. Well, Lord willing, the creek don't rise. This is your brother from another mother saying I'll be back with more insights for your healing and freedom journey. But in the meantime, I'm out.